So good morning, good evening to everyone who's calling in from the United States and from Southeast Asia. We're going to give everyone a minute or two to come in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started with the discussion. So please feel free to hang tight, and we'll start very shortly. All right, so I see people are still trickling in from the waiting room. So thank you everyone for joining us. Today we're going to get started momentarily. But in the meantime, I just want to say it's delight to see many familiar names on here again for what is now the fourth in our Mekong Water Data Hour series, which for those who are new to the series is a monthly Mekong data seminar featuring presentations on recent studies and papers with an interactive discussion about the data and why it matters for the Mekong. So I think in the interest of time, and since I see we're starting to slow the trickle of new arrivals, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Courtney Weatherby. I'm the Deputy Director for the Southeast Asia program at the Stimson Center, and I'm very happy to be chairing today's discussion, which is on dam impacts in the 3S Basin in Southeast Asia. We're going to be joined today by my colleague, Brian Eiler, who's the director of the Southeast Asia program and is going to present on this study, followed by a very interactive discussion with two of our friends and experts from Cambodia, Savran Sum, who's a PhD student at the Royal University of Phnom Penh, and Buntun Mak, who's the program manager and network coordinator for the NGO Forum on Cambodia and manages the Rivers Coalition in Cambodia project. So for those who aren't familiar with the 3S Basin, it is one of the largest tributary basins in the Mekong system. It contributes around 20% of the river's annual flow. And like the Mekong River itself, it is transboundary, running through Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And given the 3S Basin's proximity to the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia, as well as the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, the 3S Basin overall provides very important environmental services for fisheries and agriculture in the Mekong. But as you know, there's many dams that have gone up throughout the Mekong and throughout the 3S over the last few decades. So I am going to turn things over to Brian Eiler to talk a little bit and present on a study that he led recently, looking at the impacts of dams in the 3S Basin. So Brian, happy to turn things over to you.
Thanks, Courtney. It's great to be here with everyone to talk about this new study that we are soon launching. I'm really excited to discuss the impacts of how dams are impacting the 3S Basin. Not because I have good news, but it's because this is a rather understudied aspect of the 3S Basin, which the 3S gets a lot of attention in terms of its ecological value, in terms of the way that communities rely on the resources of the 3S Basin and its contribution to fisheries of the entire Mekong Basin. But little is known about how dams are impacting the 3S Basin. So we're going to take a deep dive into these rivers today. That's the Mekong River that runs from Vietnam through Laos, then into Cambodia, the San, which starts in Vietnam, and then runs into Cambodia, and then the Srei Pok, which starts in Vietnam as well, runs into Cambodia. And all three of these rivers come together into the Mekong mainstream in Cambodia. Look at some maps real quick. But this peer-reviewed study will soon be published. I was the lead author on it. Courtney Weatherby is a co-author with me. Our co-lead for the Mekong Dam Monitor, Alan Bassiste, is also a co-author. And Regan Kwan contributed much of the data work to determine how dams are impacting this part of the Mekong. So let me get started here with a presentation. I trust this is coming through clearly. So we're going to look at how dams are impacting the 3S Basin. And today during this talk, I'm going to go over why the 3S Basin is important, kind of some fun facts about the 3S Basin. We're going to look at how dams in the 3S compare to other dams in the Mekong. That's going to be a brief introduction to our findings. And then really we dive into the methods and the findings of how do dams impact each of the 3S rivers. And we put all of the data together of how the dams impact each of those rivers to then look at how all 3S dams impact the Mekong mainstream. And importantly, we're looking at 20 dams throughout the entirety of the 3S basin, 20 dams that are larger in power generation capacity than 50 megawatts. Now, the 3S has recently been in the news, and we helped kind of shed light on what might have been happening. The Saison River, which is the middle of the 3S rivers, which starts in Vietnam and runs through Cambodia in Tanakiri province, it recently ran dry. And RFA Khmer Service ran a story about how likely the Yali Falls Dam, which is in Vietnam, upstream of the Saison in Cambodia, did something. It reduced its flow, or the article said that the Yali Falls Dam closed. But in this GIF file, you can see here that really from the 29th of April to the 30th, the river essentially ran dry and something happened. We were able to look into this, and we're not quite sure if it was the Yali Falls Dam that caused a major flow restriction, but we do think that one of the dams on the upper Cascade in Vietnam, of which there are 6, caused the massive reduction in flow. And part of this was related to climate, that there was just overall lack of water availability, and part of it was also related to the way the dams are operated. Importantly, the communities downstream were not given ample early warning that this was going to happen. And that's one of our topics of discussion today, the need for early warning when things like this happen to communities downstream. In this case, it would be a transboundary early warning message from Vietnam to Cambodia that would let the communities downstream know that this is going to happen. But best case is that it doesn't happen at all. And there are ways to operate dams that prevent this type of sudden drop in river level, or sudden rise in river level too. And we'll talk about that some today. Now, why is the 3S River important? Well, Courtney mentioned that it provides about 20% of flow to the Mekong mainstream. And that's important because it's on much less than 20% of the land of the Mekong Basin. And the 3S Basin is actually located in one of the wettest parts of the world. It enjoys precipitation both from the early monsoon effect that happens throughout much of the Mekong, as well as the easterly monsoon effect that happens later during the wet season that comes from Vietnam. And because of that, its wet season is a little bit later than much of the Mekong. And we're going to see some data on how that wet season is a bit later. And it provides an important flow contribution to the Mekong flood pulse. So you can think of the 3S basin as kind of a pumping mechanism during the wet season to send water into the Mekong mainstream to help the Tonle Sap expand and help the Vietnamese delta be very wet. And this produces fisheries for Cambodia, the highest level of freshwater fishery in the world, as well as an amazing rice output for Vietnam and Cambodia. So that pumping effect each wet season contributes to the expansion of the floodplain, just as the water that comes from the downstream, from the upstream portions above the 3S does. Now, interestingly, we found that the 3S combined dry season contribution is actually more than the wet season contribution. And this is from looking at MRC data. MRC has a long data series for the Saison and the Srei Pak Basin that comes from Cambodia's National Mekong Commission. The Mekong data is much less sparse, but we were able to put together some analysis that shows the dry season contribution is about 30% of total flow. Wet season contribution to the entire Mekong Basin is about 20% of total flow. And then total contribution is about 22%. And I want to caveat that this is to Stung Treng, Cambodia. So it's not for the entire basin, but it's for most of the basin. It's harder to measure these contributions downstream. More information on why the 3S is important. Well, a lot of people live there, and 4.4 million people, in fact, and it's most densely populated in the Vietnamese portions. So this is the Central Highlands areas, Dak Lak, Gia Lai, Kon Tum. You might be familiar with the A Shau Valley or the Alloy Valley, where much of the most intense battles of the U.S. conflict in Vietnam was fought. This is all part of the Upper Mekong Basin. And Population density decreases as the rivers flow into Laos and Cambodia, but Cambodia in particular is growing very quickly in terms of its population. And there are towns and cities like Stung Treng that are experiencing rapid population growth. There are many indigenous communities in this part of the Mekong. And so, for example, in Cambodia, there are indigenous Lao communities that speak Lao, and much of Cambodia's portion of the 3S Basin. Interestingly, there's a lot of hydropower development going on there. And this hydropower development that we can see on the right varies in terms of the size of dams and the size of active storage. So that's how much water can be used in these basins. But importantly, as hydropower is being developed, it's important to consider what other natural resources are being produced in the 3S Basin. So, for example, the 3S rivers, the Mekong, the Basin, and the Strait Pak, are important migratory channels for fish throughout the entirety of that system. And fish come in and out of the 3S system and live a portion of their lives in the Tonle Sap and go back and forth each year. So there's this kind of swing effect from the 3S into the Tonle Sap Lake, which is the world's largest freshwater fishery, and then back up to spawn into the headwaters. More than 300 species of fish are found in the 3S Basin, making it one of the richest sub-basins in the world for fish varieties. And per person in the 3S Basin, people consume about 35 to 45 kilograms of fish per year, and that varies country to country and through different parts of the river system. But that's a lot of fish, right? 35 to 45 kilograms of fish per year. You might be familiar with some of the recent impacts. The Lower Saison 2, which is one of the largest dots on this map here, blocks the in the Strait Pak rivers. And there's a fish ladder there, but by my assessment and the assessment of many others, that fish ladder is woefully inadequate. So this dam itself, before it was built, was predicted to reduce the total Mekong fishery by almost 10%. And those impacts are playing out now. So that fish consumption that I mentioned earlier is also being impacted. Now, you might be surprised to see that there are 9 large dams in the Mekong Basin. Now, these are not built on the Mekong mainstream. There are no dams yet completed on the Mekong mainstream, although one is under construction, and that's very concerning. But there are some large dams there. There are, I believe, 6 dams on Vietnam's portion of the Saison River in a hydropower cascade, and 4 on Vietnam's portion of the Strait Pak River. So there's already a lot of damming happening here. Some of that is feeding industrialization and local use in Vietnam's Central Highlands, but much is being exported to areas outside of the 3S Basin. So that's important, that the beneficiaries of hydropower development in the 3S Basin are not necessarily living within the 3S itself. Now, how does the 3S compare to other dams in the Mekong? Well, as a total cascade or a grouping of dams, the 3S Basin ranks 3rd in terms of sub-basin groupings, according to our own analysis, where we use satellites to measure the amount of usable water or active storage in these dams. China's dams, of which there are 11, hold a lot of water, multiples more than what the dams in the 3S Basin hold, actually about the same amount of water than all the other 5 sub-basin categories we have there are in China's dams. But yet the 3S Basin and those 20 dams hold about 6 cubic kilometers or 6 billion meters of cubic meters of water. And that's a significant amount of water. And what we're going to do during this talk is look at how that amount of water impacts the rivers themselves, as well as the Mekong mainstream. Now, if you look at the emboldened dams on the figure on the right, you'll see that there are 5 dams that are located in the 3S River that rank within the top 16 largest dams in the Mekong Basin for active storage. The Seikaman 1 is in the Mekong Basin. It ranks 8th. The Lower Saison 2 ranks 10th in the Mekong Basin, with 1 cubic kilometer of water. And then the Saint Nam Noi, which is kind of famous for its accident in 2018 that burst and caused the death of scores of people and the displacement of more than 4,000. It also ranks within the top 16 dams. So there are some large dams in the big picture of things in the 3S Basin. So now let's go into each of these rivers. The Mekong River has the most dams on it and is the most dammed and has the largest amount of active storage. And most of that has come in over the last 7 years with the addition of the Seikaman 1, which is the largest dam in the 3S system, the Saint Nam Noi Dam in 2018, and then also the Nam Kong 3, which is part of a Nam Kong cascade, of which there are now 3 dams. The Nam Kong 2 doesn't necessarily qualify for our, no, I'm sorry, it does qualify as part of this analysis, but it's very small. And you can see that the active storage, or the amount of water that can be used for hydropower production, has increased over time from 0 in the early 90s to now 3.29 cubic kilometers. So we're able to, again, determine those numbers using satellite derived methods. We use radar from the European Space Agency to look at the altimetry and level of these dams. And over time, we are able to string together that data to understand how the dams are operated. So here are some images of the way that the largest dams in the Mekong Basin are operated. There's the Saint Nam Noi Dam, there's the Seikaman 1, the Nam Kong 3, and you can see similar patterns for them. That during the wet seasons, which are in gray, the dams fill up. Why do they do that? Because it's raining, right? They fill up, and then they drain during the dry season. That's the white shaded parts. And when they're draining, they're producing hydropower. When they're filling up, they could be producing some hydropower, but they're recharging their reservoirs using the precipitation from the wet season. And we're able to determine, again, the amount of active storage in each of these dams and how they're operated. And we can see that the Saint Nam Noi, the Nam Kong 3, the Seikaman 1 are operated in a similar way as what we would call a seasonal storage dam. So they store water during the wet season and they release their water during the dry season for hydropower production. The Nam Kong 2 graph at the bottom right looks a little bit different. There's a lot more fluctuation there. It kind of acts like a seasonal storage dam, but it fluctuates more. And that's due to interactions with the Nam Kong 3 dam upstream, as well as other ways that the dam is operated. And we're going to take a deeper dive into some of these fluctuations and what they mean when we look at the rest of the other 2 rivers. But when we put all the information about how these dams are operated together, we can see that more storage is coming into operation or affecting this basin over the period of time from 2017 to 2023. You can see the addition of the purple dam there, the Sapien Saint Nam Noi. It comes online and really starts to fill and drain from 2019 onward, as well as the new addition of the Nam Kong 3 dam, which is a large dam that shows up in 2022 and then is rising and falling over time. So the Mekong is adding in terms of the amount of water that's in these reservoirs. It's adding new dams. And again, it's the largest in terms of how much active storage. Now, with our analysis of the Mekong, we kind of have to stop here. And I'm sorry about that, but it's due to the lack of data availability downstream at that Siem Pang gauge in Cambodia. So there are no reliable river gauges in the Mekong River that allow us to compare how the amount of water that's coming out of these dams is impacting the river levels. We're going to see this in the Say San and the Srei Pak rivers, but unfortunately we can't see it in the Mekong River. And this leads us to our first recommendation that the Cambodian National Mekong Committee and the Mekong River Commission need to fix that gauge. It was very beneficial to have accurate discharge data or flow volume data from the Mekong River, because then we can determine the change in actual river level that comes from dam impacts. So to kind of take a step back and thinking about how dams change seasonal effects to the river, we want to look at this diagram here. This diagram shows the shape of how the flood pulse works throughout the course of the year for the Mekong and for rivers that rely on monsoonal or seasonal effects to provide natural resources for the people and the animals, the flora and the fauna of the river system. So the blue line shows a very reliable low dry season level. And then when the wet season comes, June, July, August, the river starts to rise again, and then it falls. And this is kind of the seasonal rise and fall of the Mekong River. And we call it the flood pulse. And what dams do when they release water during the dry season, they raise the level of the river system unnaturally. And this does not allow the sides of the rivers to dry out. It does not allow the sediment that has collected on the side of the river to be used for floodplain agriculture, and communities along the river sides often utilize this space for agricultural production. They keep flooded forests in Cambodia and other parts of the Mekong flooded year round, and that's not good because the flooded forests don't have a chance to dry out. Raising the river level does not necessarily push out salinity intrusion in the Mekong Delta, and we can jump back into that if you're interested. And then there are often these shocks, these releases, and that's the fluctuation that I talked about that cause sudden and noticeable changes in river level. So that would be the example that we started with on the Basin Basin of a sudden change in the river level. During the wet season, dams restore their reservoirs. So they pull down the shape of the flood pulse and they reduce the peak. And they also could change the timing of the peak. And this changes how long the floodplain of the Mekong is flooded, how much sediment is transported downstream, and ultimately has a reduction of fish stocks and farming productivity. So to put this into perspective, in 2020, the Tonle Sap, and you got to remember that the Tonle Sap in the Mekong floodplain is fed by the pulse from the 3S system, as well as the pulse that comes down from the entirety of the Mekong upstream. In September 2020, the Tonle Sap pulse didn't happen. And you can see that here, that the green in the map on the left is how much the Tonle Sap should expand at late September in a year. And the blue is the actual amount of expansion. Now, much of this was driven by climate and a lack of precipitation, but dams also had an impact. So we want to think about how dams are reducing that pulse. And the data shows that the pulse is being reduced. So during the very dry years of 2017 to 21, actually the really dry wet seasons were 2019, 2020, and 2021. The pulse came down. So we're seeing a picture that's very similar to that example that I just gave you, that during the dry season, the river level and the Tonle Sap is coming up a bit, and then the peak is pulling down. So as we look through how dams in the Saison and the Srepak are impacting river flow, we want to think about how they're also impacting the pulse and the expansion capabilities of the Tonle Sap River. So let's take a deep dive into that. So the Saison River, a similar diagram over time, is adding more and more storage. You might find it interesting to know that there are two large storage dams in Vietnam's portion of the Saison River. These are the far upstream dams, the Yali Falls Dam and the Plei Krong Dam, hold a significant amount of water. Both rank within our top 16 largest dams in the system. And then the lower Saison 2 was added in 2018 to bring total storage in the Saison Basin to 2.7 cubic kilometers of active storage. Now that's about a tenth of one of China's large dams. So you got to remember that across these 7 dams, about a tenth of one of China's large dams is in the Saison Basin. Now, how are these dams operated? Well, the Plei Krong, the Yali Falls, the two on the top, the large storage dams are operated in what we see a very reliable way of releasing their water for hydropower production during the dry season and recharging during the wet season. Interestingly, during the very difficult years of 2019 to 2021, we don't see a lot of differences in the way these dams are operated in terms of water availability. So they took proportionally more water out of the system during these very dry years of 2019 to 2021. Now look at Saison 3 and even lower Saison 2. Saison 3 is moving a lot. It's fluctuating, right? And this is probably one of the reasons why river levels downstream are changing very rapidly. So we think the Saison 3 dam is hydropeaking. It could be acting to regulate the way that flows are coming out of the large dams upstream, but we think the data suggests that it's hydropeaking. So it's responding to daily hydropower demand, likely around it, in the cities around it, and it can produce a lot of electricity by doing these kind of extreme pumping mechanisms from day to day. And it's a great way to produce electricity, but it has severe and profound impacts on the downstream. And it's these kinds of operations that we feel need to have early warning, because they can change the community's access to water, and they can cause actually sudden floods during the wet seasons, or during the dry season and the wet seasons of any year. Lower Saison 2, interesting. We believe the Lower Saison 2 dam is mostly operated as a run-of-river dam, meaning that the amount of water that's flowing into it is the amount of water that's flowing out, except for sometimes when it's operated not as a run-of-the-river dam. And you can see these kind of deep cuts, right? You see these ways that the dams are suddenly, the Lower Saison 2 reservoir suddenly drops. And most recently this happened. So it goes from very full to very low levels. We're not sure why that happens. It could be in response to a sudden demand of electricity, say in Phnom Penh, or it could be as a response to maintain and to kind of clean out the reservoir. But this is an interesting find, and those types of sudden drops cause sudden increases in river level downstream. I'm going to just briefly touch on this, that if we look at old time series data from the Saison River, you can see in the 1960s, 1965 and 1969, here's a great benefit of the data that the Mekong River Commission has. You see this kind of very reliable, low, downward sloping dry season river level that gets drier and drier and lower. And then as more dams are being built, their impacts are introduced to the river system. So you see this fluctuation. So this is at the Vunsai gauge in Cambodia, catching the kind of fluctuation that dam operations can deliver to the downstream areas. And again, this is another reason why we think that the downstreams deserve and need much more early warning to know what type of fluctuation is coming. If you look more closely at the data, you can actually see that the dams being constructed, the river kind of goes flat because some of the upstream dams aren't operating, waiting for some downstream dams to be completed. We talk about this more in the report, but importantly, this is how you can start to see the impacts of dams in the data, just by looking at the way the rivers are flowing. So if we put this together over time, we're seeing, again, increased storage in the Saison River system. This is when we're putting the operations of all dams together, particularly in 2018, when the Lower Saison 2 comes online, you get a big raise in the amount of storage that is available in the system. And then these fluctuations are being introduced, right? So the fluctuations that you see are affecting, and that's that jaggedness at the top of the line. It's affecting the total river level throughout the system, and then even below the Lower Saison 2 dam. And this kind of jaggedness and up and down are changing both the flood pulse and the regularity of the flow of the Mekong. So now let's do some analysis to actual flow. On the left, what we're doing is we're taking MRC data and combining it with the volume data that our team has collected for how dams release water during the dry season. And we're seeing the amount of water that is being released into the Saison River from dams each year. So this is taking gauge data from that Vunsai gauge for dry season 2018 to 2022. And you can see the amount of water that's released is about the same. Importantly, the Lower Saison 2 isn't part of this analysis because the Vunsai gauge is above the Lower Saison 2. So what you're seeing here is the impacts of Vietnam's dams in Cambodia. So the amount of blue, light blue on this left graph is about the same for each year, but flow varies year to year due to natural conditions. And again, like 2019, 2020, 2021 were severely dry for the entirety of the Mekong, you can see 2020 was really dry for the Mekong Basin. So those releases in the Saison increased flow by 13% to the Vunsai Gauge in Cambodia. That's a pretty significant increase. And if we take a deeper dive into 2020, looking month per month of the dry season, the increases are much more significant. So there's an ability to raise flow by 31% in January, by 52% in March, by 34% in May. Some pretty significant increases to flow. And we talked about what the impacts are, the ecological and community-based impacts to flow increases during the dry season already. Now, what about the wet season? Wet season dam restrictions bring down the flow. So the way to interpret these charts are that the height of the bar, the blue and the red together, total what should be coming down the river. So we're taking dam restrictions plus observed flow from the Mekong River Commission. And we're seeing that in those very difficult years, again, the Saison dams in Vietnam are reducing flow between 4 to 6%, not small numbers. And if we take a deeper dive into 2020, they reduced flow by 27% in October. So that's just to the Saison River. In a bit, we're gonna look and see at the total impact to the Mekong Basin. Now we go to the Srei Pak Basin, there's a lot less storage in these 4 dams. There's a large dam there, the Bun Tara Dam, it's the most upstream. It operates like a seasonal storage dam too, and the rest of them just fluctuate like crazy. So they're hydropeaking or they're re-regulating, probably doing a combination of both. And the important thing to think about with the Srei Pak is since there's less active storage, there's less impact on the river system of the Srei Pak itself. But you can still see that the dams take out a lot of water during the wet season and they release most of that water during the dry season. And there are some of these severe fluctuations that we've already talked about. Looking at dry season impacts in 2020, again, that very difficult year, flow was increased by 11% due to dam releases. And if we take a deeper dive into that particular year of 2020, January, 15%, March, 41% increase of flow, May, 30% increase of flow. Wet season dam impacts are much less because there's a lot of flow coming through the Srei Pak and not so much active storage. So the numbers actually don't register for flow restrictions for total wet season flow year to year. They're much less than 1%. But if we look at each month, we get different numbers. So September in 2019, there was a 4% flow restriction. So these dams, they do have an effect on the river systems themselves. The Saison impacts are much larger because there's much more storage there, but the impacts are now measurable and able to be understood. And if these impacts are important to be mitigated, that communities can better adapt and adjust, and that natural flow possibly could be restored, knowing how these impacts are playing out over time can give insight as to how dams upstream can be better operated in a more optimal way that can provide for communities downstream. Now, I'm getting to the end of the talk here, so we have enough time for a discussion. How do all these dams impact the Mekong mainstream? So we're able to put all 20 dam operations together and do a similar analysis as we've done to the Saison and the Srei Pak Basin. So here you go, folks. The dry season dam additions to the river system in the toughest year of 2020 increased total Mekong flow by 5.8%. Not a small number, right? In the largest month of increase of 2020, dams increased total Mekong flow by 23%, 22.8%. So that's a monthly kind of maximum impact we think that the 3S dams can change on the Mekong River system. Now let's bring in a comparison of China's dams, okay? So we also have been collecting information on how China's dams change the Stung-Treng gauge. So here we're looking at cumulative impacts, 3S plus China. We're excluding some other dam impacts, but just to bring a comparison to 3S in China. China's dams have much more impact at the Stung Treng gauge in Cambodia than 3S dams. And that's because there's a lot more water that can be changed in the reservoirs upstream that can be released or restricted. But you're seeing China's dams increase flow by 34%, by 27% during those difficult years of 2019 and 2020. And then monthly, 39% increase, 25% increase, 41% increase. But look at March 2020 and how these two sets of dams work together to increase flow by more than 50%. All right. And if flow reduction is natural flow restoration is important, then there should be some consideration given to how much these dams are actually increasing the flow of the river. Now, what you see here, the dark color is the natural curve of the Mekong dry season. We don't really see that as much in what the gauge data shows. And the low point of the dry season in 2020 has changed. Naturally, it would have occurred in March, but because of upstream dam releases, it happened in February. Wrapping up soon, wet season dam operations, how do they affect the Stung Treng gauge? So the 3S system, pretty small effect on total Mekong flow. Impacts in the toughest years of less than 2% flow reduction. Particular months, September 2019, almost a 2% flow reduction. November, 3% flow reduction. Compare that to China's flow reduction impacts to Stung Treng. China's dams can reduce flow to Stung Treng by 4% in a wet season, by 7% in a dry season, by 6% in a dry season. And then in particular months, like in 2019, which was the year that the 3S dams did the most flow reduction, China's dams can reduce flow by 22%, okay, in the month of October. So the point is that these dams act together to reduce the total Mekong flood pulse. And if the flood pulse is to be restored, now we get a feel for which dams and which combinations of dams have the more profound impacts and how it's possible to maybe counter some of these effects, to reoperate the dam system as a combination or in a cumulative sense that can restore some of natural flow to the Mekong and help the Tonle Sap expand, and also help these, or not actually help, but to optimize power production and operate the dams in a more sensible way that has a trade-off that allows communities, natural resources, fisheries to be promoted, but also hydropower to be promoted. So I've got some recommendations here. I'm not going to go through all of them. I actually touched on most of them during my presentation. These are the main recommendations that our study comes with. Need for better gauges. There should be gauges in the upstream portions of these rivers in Laos and Vietnam. There should be a gauge at the bottom below where all these three rivers come together before they go into the Mekong mainstream. And then that would allow better analysis and understanding of how these dams impact the river. There's a need for better early warning. Hydro-peaking effects should be mitigated or communicated to the downstream. And importantly, there are plans for many, many more dams to be built on these rivers. And now that there's an understanding of how active storage and operations impact the river systems, countries should go carefully and plan more carefully with consideration of new dams' impacts to the flood pulse reduction and the overall natural resource availability of the river system. So thank you, and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Brian, for kicking us off. In the interest of time, I'm going to not share very lengthy bios for each of our discussants. They are on the event webpage, but we're delighted to have Severin Zoom with us today, as well as Buntun Mak. And I'm going to have Severin jump in first to share some questions and comments. And just for brief background, she's a PhD student in applied ecology and management at the Royal University of Phnom Penh, and also works on the wonders of the Mekong project. So I think she can share some really great on-the-ground insights and questions about what this data that Brian has just presented might mean for the sector that she works in. So Severin, happy to turn things over to you.
Hello, I'm Severin from Cambodia. Thank you for your presentation. It's very important and also study about water quality in Tonle Sap. Tonle Sap is also connected with the Mekong River and also 3S, so it's very neat. So first I have a question, like you already saw that after building dam, water flow in the Mekong changed. So I would like to know that is we convert from the change, like water Mekong water flow change it affect to the ecosystem. If we convert those value to the money, I mean how much is it, and who should be respond to those change?
Right. We aren't able to do any on-ground research for this study. And some of the peer review comments that came back to us said, have you met with communities to talk about how their livelihoods are changing, how the fisheries are being reduced from either Lower Saison 2 Dam or the overall kind of flood pulse effects, or the way that the upstream dams of Vietnam block access to spawning grounds. Those studies have been done. There's a lot of work on community change in the 3S system, but it also points to the need for more studies. So it's possible to take this information now with knowledge of how the Saison and the Srei Pak rivers have been manipulated and correlate that with change of natural resource access to communities, whether that's, to riverbank agriculture or to how fisheries are being reduced, and then put some dollars and cents on it. And look at causality, right? It's important to remember that there's weather change too. If we looked through like dry season flow from year to year, from 2017 to the present, dry season flow changes in each of these basins in and of itself, and that's due to weather variability. Wet season flow is changing. It was very low under natural conditions from 2019 to 2021. But we're finding that during these low flow years that are caused mostly by precipitation, that dams are impacting the rivers and the natural resource bases much more proportionally, because they act the same basically regardless of how much it's raining. They take the same amount of water out. So there's a larger proportional effect. And that's why it's important to, if it's known, like for this coming wet season, we now know that the El Nino effect is going to likely bring robust rain to the system. But if it's forecasted that the basin is going to be dry because of rain effects, then dams don't have to take so much water out, right? And more value can be provided through the water, the natural flow of the Mekong, to communities downstream. But to get the heart of the question is other researchers need to do that dollars and cents analysis. Savun, you'd be great for that. Boomturn, you'd be great for that. And now you have some dam operations data in hand.
Thanks, Brian. Severin, did you want to raise any other questions before I turn things over to Boomturn?
Can I raise later?
Okay. So our second discussant for today is Boomturn Mak, who's joining us from the NGO Forum on Cambodia, where he's worked for, I think, over 5 years now as a program manager, and also as the coordinator for the Rivers Coalition in Cambodia project. And Boomturn has a long history of working on water management and other environmental and resource governance issues. So Boomturn, happy to turn things over to you for your own comments and questions.
Thank you, Connie, and thank you, Brian, for precise presentations on the 3S river system and the change of the flow regimes on the system. First, I would like to say congratulations for your team to make this study happen. It's important, to develop this information and data, and this information will support as one of the evidence for CSO to communicate with the government as well as the others relevant stakeholders, including the Mekong River Commissions. And based on what you have explained, it's clear that the change, the costs, the factors, the cost of the change of the flow regime in the Suez River system, as well as the Mekong mainstream. That's would impacts on the ecological process, as well as the ecosystem and the local livelihood of the local communities are visible, and as you have seen in the last few years, and I even recently, there is no solution has not been realized yet. And it's I feel that there's a lot of technical data and information. Given that I'm not a technical person, it's a little bit hard for me. But however, given that I am working with the local communities, focusing on the social economic impacts on the local community, so it's better to to interpret and translate this to local knowledge, and that would be easy for the local community as well as the civil society organizations to use for the advocacy with the government. And it's the research suggestion is clear, and it's implementable, and it's value for the government to take this into account to improve the conditions of the basins and the Suez River system. And I've observed that this reflects the cascade dam management needs to be improved, as well as the cooperation, transboundary cooperations need to be enhanced as well, in order to provide early warning system to river communities to be prepared in advance for any disaster in the futures. My suggestion, not really a question, but suggestions to clarify in terms of the I didn't see the climate change scenario was included in this study, because the climate change also influence the the flow regime, as well as the operations of the dams. Second, I still wonders the accuracies of the model that you use to analyze the delta. For instance, you use the remote sensing, from the satellites, and how much accurate it is, and it's need further explanations on that. And the other thing is the I've been working and communicating all the challenges and common and suggestion challenge with the Mekong River Commission. It's hard to bring this concerns to the MRC unless we have a strong evidence. And I'm not sure whether this I mean, that's how to get the MRC accepted with the results that the study conducted. And it's about local knowledge, because the study has a lot of technical information, while we are working with the community in terms of the social economic impacts, the livelihood impacts, and cultural impact, social impact. So it could be simplify it's to be more easier to understand for the CSO as well as communities. And also the gap of the coping strategies for the local communities. that's all from me, and
Great,
hope
great
you got
comments.
my point.
Well, and I have a question for you here in a bit, but I was able to give preview of these results to the Mekong River Commission a few weeks ago when I visited in Vientiane. Great questions asked, no particular responses in terms of, agreement or concurrence. Perhaps after we publish this, there could be more of a formal conversation with the MRC and other relevant stakeholders on both the implications and the accuracy. But in a report from last year, I think the MRC gave good credence or kind of a sign of support for the methods that we use, saying that there might be some kind of an error, but the error that's involved with the methods we use is acceptable and allows for a general understanding of how these dams are being operated and how much water is in the particular reservoirs at any one point in time. So I encourage you to read that January low flows report where the MRC talks about our methods. And just to be clear, we use a method that we've tested against reservoirs that produce data, and we're able to show that our method gets within a plus or minus 1 meter error of the particular the actual reservoir level. So we're quite accurate. There is still some acceptable error there, and from that we translate into volume of these reservoirs. Regan Kwan's here. He can go into a little bit more deeply if needed, but I'm going to move on with one question to you, Bunturn, and to Sabun too, and then we'll go to questions from those calling in. With this need for early warning, Vietnam, with their cascades upstream, they do provide early warning sometimes, and there has been improvement on this from a transboundary early warning aspect. For that case that I showed at the beginning of the talk of just 3 weeks ago when the Saison River dried out suddenly, there was no warning given. At least it might have come much later. And so there's still a lot that can be done in terms of early warning improvements. What are you hearing from communities in these river systems for needs for early warning? What about the kind of early warning language used, the timing? What are people saying? What are their actual needs?
Well, it was a surprising for them as to for the dry out of the Saison rivers. It was also a surprise for me because they share photos of the dry out of the rivers, and I asked them whether they have known this before the Saison River dry out, but they said they didn't know, and it's kind of surprising for them. And they have shown us the impacts of the fish population, because when the water level lows and then the fish stay in the pool, and then people fish in the pool, and so it's generate impacts for the fish and for the long term, because it's affect the fish population in the futures.
Yeah, I think the RFA article showed these piles of fish coming out of the river because the pools were drying out and the fish were just easily there to be caught. And there's this kind of
so one thing I would like to add, in Cambodia we use one of the system, early warning system. It's used by the telephone system, a mobile system. It's called what I learned from the community is the 1294 digits. It's a mobile system. You have to register to receive the informations, warning system about the flood, about the drought, in order for communities to be prepared in advance for any disaster. But you have to register through phones. Some of people they register, but that's not wholly well aware for the whole communities. Only the people working in the area, especially the NGO staff and governments who are engaging in this area, they subscribe to the system. But I learned from my colleagues there, so they inform me that they receive only the information about the flood only, because
not the drought.
concerning the drought seems to little or to no information about the drought. So this is it's similar to the case of the dry of the Basin river in the last one.
Right. Just one last point, and we'll go to the questions from the audience. And Savun, perhaps there's opportunities for you to answer some questions from the audience too. Is that I think in the lower Basin, there's a lot of kind of blame that's put on the Ali Falls Dam, because everyone knows that dam there, that it's the first dam that was built. It has an easy to remember name. And then when anything happens, it's the Ali Falls Dam, because there's a lack of communication. When we looked at the actual recent dam data, we didn't see the Ali Falls Dam do anything in particular. It was actually, I think it was the Basin 3 dam that had a quick restriction of water. So we saw something happen there, although we're not sure, we can't say definitively that's what happened. So that just goes to show that there's much more need for awareness building of what's upstream from these communities, what's actually causing the change, and much more work to be done. But Courtney, over to you.
Sure. So we've got about 5 minutes left on the call. I think we'll go a little bit over time at our side to try and answer some of these questions, but we've got a handful of questions from the audience, and I'm just going to start with 2 of them from Mai Chan with Radio Free Asia, who's circling back to the early warning system concept and how something like that could be implemented. So Mai Chan asks, do the 3 countries, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, have a cooperation mechanism to support coordinated operation of dams on 3S rivers to limit adverse social and economic impacts? And if they don't have a cooperation mechanism, how should they go about building a cooperation mechanism to handle these challenges of transboundary impacts of hydropower dams in the 3S? So Brian, I think this is probably directed to you, but I would welcome inputs from Binh Thuy or Savun as well.
Yeah, I'll answer very briefly. The answer is yes, kind of. And it's probably the only example of effective or semi-effective transboundary early warning in the Mekong system. And it goes to show the level of responsibility and attention that the Vietnamese, which are in the headwaters, pay to the downstream releases. But much more can be done. Binh Thuy pointed out that the drops aren't warned. There's no warning given on drops. And the early warning might be given from government to government level, but the effectiveness of getting that message to communities in language that can cause them to act and change, that's where the improvement needs to come. And here's an example. Last year, the Aloy Dam, far in the upstream of the Mekong Basin, had a massive release of water due to a dam risk situation, that the reservoir was full, storm was coming in, it had to release a bunch of water. So the Vietnamese government sent early warning to the Lao government that this was happening. The Lao government sent it down the chain to the province. So in Attapua, in the city of Attapua in the Mekong Basin, warning was given, but nobody paid attention to it because that dam, the people said, this is hundreds of kilometers away. How can that affect us? And then the wave of water came through and damage was caused to restaurants, floating restaurants and other businesses along the river's edge in Attapua. So there's a trust issue. There's kind of a ability to routinize the information, to know that it's coming and that's believable as well. So much more room for improvement. But Savun and Binh Thuy, what do you, any comments on early warning and the successes from a transboundary perspective?
May I, Savun? Okay. Well, I agree with your comment, Brian. It's true. There is a mechanism, cooperation mechanism between country and country, bilateral, Vietnam and Cambodia. There is a committees to handle this, the Cascade Dam operation on the Basin rivers. In terms of the regional, there is a Mekong River Commission's mechanism. But in terms of the mechanism, bilateral country, I feel it's work between the government and the some of the local government only for the local community, it's difficult to receive this information. It's depends on the the kinds of the local communities to inform. The commitment of the local community to inform the local, the local authority to inform the local communities. Right. So it doesn't work. I feel that it doesn't work wholly for to benefit for the local community to receive the early warning information from the committee.
Siobhan, thoughts?
Well, to me, I just saw the information from the social media like Facebook. They provide information that there is a when they release and there is some flood in upstream. Just know from the social media only.
Right. Well, and that shows the power of social media, right? That the social media is a viable channel for releasing this information. We do this on the upstream for China's dams releases or restrictions to how those impact the Golden Triangle. Actually, we're able to watch the impacts all the way to close to Vientiane, Laos, and give early warning to tens of thousands of people who live along the river's corridor. And we do that mostly through social media, through Facebook. And we pay to target the delivery of those warnings to communities. And we can see people acting.
Great, and I'm gonna go ahead and ask one more question, which is, I think, again, mostly for Brian. This is a question about the future. So, you mentioned there's additional dam capacity planned for the region. We had one person, and I'm gonna combine a couple of questions here. We had one person noting that they've heard about a potential expansion of the Yali Dam. So there's, curiosity about whether you've been able to look at that and the extent to which they're looking to rebuild and expand the capacity at Yali and how this might impact the system. But more broadly, did you have a chance, or is there an opportunity to look at the ongoing impacts that you've analyzed and then compare that against potentially projected impacts from EIAs for individual dams or sort of a broader cumulative expansion of hydropower capacity in the basin?
So Courtney and I and our team, we've done some connectivity analysis of how future dam build out in the 3S would change river connectivity, basically cutting off migration pathways for fish. And right now the Mekong River is fully free-flowing, the mainstream, but it's soon to be cut off by the Mekong A Dam. And that's going to cut off total connectivity to the 3S system to the Tonle Saps, because the lower Saison 2 already blocks the migratory fish passage for the Saison and the Suipa. So it's important to preserve connectivity of the Mekong River, and no dam should be built on the mainstream, even though one is nearly finished, and more are in the works in Laos. So that would be the Mekong A downstream is almost finished. Mekong 4A, 4B, from our understanding, is being the PPAs are already signed for that. Those are large reservoir dams. Those will impact fish migration and then introduce a lot more active storage to how dams are changing the flood pulse downstream. The important thing is to talk about limits, right? And flow limits. And the Mekong Agreement has rules for flow set into how mainstream dams can or cannot change flow during the wet season and the dry season. I think it's time for those rules to be applied to new tributary dams in consideration to how the flow changes the natural pulse of the Mekong. And what are acceptable limits for hydropower development? What are thresholds that can't be passed? Because if they're passed in terms of active storage, total active storage, then the Tonle Sap expansion is going to suffer, particularly during these dry, wet seasons that we've seen in the past. And that could be a climate change effect, or it might just be a regular weather pattern. There are plans to build scores more dams in the Mekong Basin, which is ridiculous. There's ambition. Remember, the Suipa was much less dammed than the rest of the other two. So there are fewer dams and the active storage total is much less. That could pave an opportunity, right, for building more dams in the Suipa Basin. And I think the Cambodian government is looking at that as an option. but please give consideration to what the total effect of that active storage is on the flood pulse and on the downstream, now that we know some of these numbers, and go about building dams extremely carefully. I would avoid as much as possible and look at other options. Given what we know, say the combined impacts of China's dams, 3S dams, Thailand's dams, all the other dams in Laos are to the Mekong system, it's time to act in a very transboundary way for planning and operation of these dams. That's not happening yet. But I think there's a lot of data and evidence out there to show why it's time to start planning in a transboundary perspective and operating them from a transboundary perspective.
All right, well, I know we're a little bit over time already, so even though we've got a few additional questions lined up in the chat here, I think we're going to have to stop. So for those who have asked questions that weren't answered, I will share those with our panelists and they might be able to follow up with you over email. But I will answer two of these questions just verbally right now. We had a couple people asking about how to access the previous webinars. All of the recordings from these Mekong Water Data Hours are available online on the Simpson Center website. So if you just type in Mekong Water Data Hour, you should pop up with all 4 of the webinars and the future forthcoming webinars in future. And we also had a question about the link to the study. So Brian, do we have a timeline for when the study is going to be posted online?
Soon. It's in production right now. And I hope over the next 2 weeks it will be published. You can get all this data, much more, Boonton was right. He said this is kind of a very technical study. There's even more technical information coming out in what we're producing. It's a long 50-page long study, which we will distill into something much more digestible, kind of for the average Mekong watcher, in our annual report, which will come out in the next few months. So if you're interested in taking a technical deep dive, wait for the study. It's coming soon. This live stream is going to be posted on the Stimson website as soon as this event closes. And then later on, we'll have something more digestible for you, those that are kind of interested more in the policy impacts or the social environmental impacts of these findings.
All right, well, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Bunthar. Thank you, Severin. This was a great discussion. And to all of our attendees, especially those calling in the evening from Asia, thank you for making the time. We look forward to continuing this discussion at future Mekong Water Data Hours. And I hope that all of you in Asia have a wonderful night and all in the States have a great rest of the day. Thank you for